Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. You know the drill. You send us the reading material and we'll dig through it and pull out the good stuff. Today we're going to be talking about the happiness curve. You sent over some excerpts summarizing Jonathan Rauch's book, The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50. And I have to say, the idea that happiness might actually increase after midlife really caught my eye. You know, it seems like everyone always talks about midlife crises, but what does the data actually say?
That's a great question. The idea of a midlife crisis is definitely something we hear about a lot, but economists have actually identified a more nuanced pattern. They call it the U-shaped curve of happiness.
Okay, I'm listening. Break this U-shaped curve down for me. What does it actually look like in someone's life?
Well, you can think of it like this. We tend to start out pretty happy in our younger years. Then as we head into middle age, happiness levels often take a dip. They kind of bottom out somewhere between our 40s and 50s. But here's where it gets really interesting. After that dip, happiness starts to climb again. And it often surpasses those early highs as we get into our later decades.
So it's not just all downhill as we age. There's actually a potential upswing later on.
Exactly. And the book illustrates this with a story about a man named Anthony. In his early years, he seemed to have it all: a supportive mentor, academic success, even a budding romance. But as he got older, things changed. He felt pressure from his career, had to move multiple times for work, and he began to feel stagnant and frustrated, kind of like he was hitting a ceiling. His happiness plummeted.
Yeah, I think a lot of us can relate to that feeling of hitting a wall in midlife. Like, is this all there
I
is?
guess so.
But it sounds like Anthony's story is just one example, right?
Yeah.
Not everyone follows that exact pattern.
You're absolutely right. While the U-shaped curve represents a general trend that researchers have seen in large-scale studies, it's not a one-size-fits-all prediction for every single person. The book also talks about a man named Joe. His lowest point was actually in his youth because of some personal challenges. But after he turned his life around, his happiness steadily increased without any noticeable dip in midlife.
So it sounds like while this curve gives us a helpful framework, it's important to remember that everyone's experience is unique.
Precisely. It's more of a starting point for understanding this complex thing, not a crystal ball.
All right, so we've laid out this U-shaped curve of happiness, but the big question is why? Why does happiness seem to dip for so many people in middle age?
Well, you might think it's all about finances, right? That midlife is when the pressures of career, family, and mortgages really hit us. But the research suggests that social factors play an even bigger role than income when it comes to this happiness dip.
Really? That's surprising. I would have thought money would be a huge factor in happiness, especially during midlife.
It's definitely part of it. But economists have identified 6 key factors that influence happiness. And 4 of those are social. Social support, generosity, trust, and freedom. They have found that strong social connections and feeling like you belong are more strongly correlated with happiness than how much money you make.
So it's not just about the size of your bank account, but also about your connections with others, your sense of community, and being able to live authentically.
Exactly. The book talks about some really interesting research done in Peru. Researchers found that even when people's economic situations improved, some actually felt less happy.
That's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect. Why would that be?
Well, it all comes down to this idea of relative happiness. It turns out that we don't judge our happiness only on our own situation. We also compare ourselves to others, to their perceived success and happiness. And we also compare ourselves to our own expectations from the past.
Ah, the comparison game. That never really seems to lead to happiness, does it?
Yeah, it can be a real trap. And midlife seems to be a prime time for it. It's often the point when reality sets in. And we realize that we haven't accomplished everything we thought we would when we were younger. This can lead to disappointment and feeling like we're not good enough.
So those big ambitious goals we set when we were younger, full of hope, they can actually come back to haunt us later on if we don't reach them.
That's the danger. And that gap between our youthful expectations and what we've actually achieved by midlife can be a big part of why happiness dips. It's like we're always comparing ourselves to an ideal that might not even be realistic.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense. So we've got this U-shaped curve, this dip in happiness that many people feel in midlife. And it seems to be driven more by social factors and our own perceptions than just by money. But now I'm thinking, if this is such a common experience, is there anything we can do about it?
Absolutely. And that's what we'll look at next. While this dip is common, the good news is that we don't have to just sit there and take it. The book actually offers some really interesting strategies for navigating the curve and cultivating greater happiness in midlife.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about those strategies. Let's dive in.
So you want to know what we can actually do to handle this midlife dip in happiness. Well, one of the key strategies Rauch talks about in his book is thought control.
Thought control. Okay. I'm already a little skeptical. Sounds kind of Big Brother-ish, doesn't it?
Oh, it's not about mind control or anything like that. Think of it more like just being aware of and managing your thought patterns. Remember how we talked about comparing ourselves to others or to our own maybe unrealistic expectations and how that can make us unhappy? Well, thought control is about recognizing those tendencies and choosing to shift our focus.
So it's about noticing those negative thought spirals before they take over.
Exactly. And the book talks about practices like mindfulness and meditation as tools for building that awareness.
Right. Mindfulness and meditation. I hear those terms a lot, but to be honest, I don't really get how they can actually help us be happier, especially during a difficult time like midlife.
Well, with mindfulness, you try to be present in the moment without judging things. It's about noticing those negative thoughts and feelings without letting them sweep you away, like creating a little space between you and those thoughts so you're not so consumed by them.
Okay, I see how that could be useful, but what about meditation? Isn't that just sitting quietly trying to empty your mind?
It can be, but there are actually many different ways to meditate. What they all have in common is training the mind to be more focused and aware. And this awareness can help us notice when we're falling into those comparison traps or getting caught up in expectations that aren't realistic. Rauch himself mentions a simple thing he does. Whenever he starts to feel himself comparing himself to others, he shifts his attention to what's happening right now. Like he might focus on his breath or on something he can see or touch around him, just to kind of ground himself in the present.
It's funny, I used to think that mindfulness and meditation were only for like super Zen people, but the way you're describing it, it sounds more like a practical skill, something we can all work on to help us with life's ups and downs, especially during midlife.
Exactly. It's about having the tools to manage what's going on inside of us,
Hmm.
especially during those stressful times or when we're going through big changes. And this leads us to another important strategy that Rauch talks about for being happier in midlife: social connection.
Social connection, that makes sense. Earlier, we were saying how important social things are for overall happiness.
Right. But it's kind of ironic because midlife can be a time when people isolate themselves, especially if they're going through a rough patch. We might feel embarrassed about our problems like we're the only ones who have them, or we might just be so busy and overwhelmed that we forget about our social life.
Yeah, I know. I've definitely felt that pull to be alone when things are hard. It's like trying to protect yourself in a way. But it sounds like that's the opposite of what we should actually be doing.
Exactly. The research shows time and time again that having strong social connections is super important for being happy and healthy. And this isn't about having tons of friends. It's about having people you can really talk to, people who will listen without judging, and who offer support even if they can't fix the problem.
So it's not really about getting advice or answers. It's more about just being seen and understood.
Exactly. The book tells a story about a man named Terry who had really bad anxiety after his second child was born. He felt overwhelmed and stuck, and he started avoiding his friends and family. But what finally helped him was just talking to his friends about what was happening.
Wow, that really hits home. Those early years of being a parent can be so isolating and overwhelming. It's easy to feel like you're the only one struggling.
You're definitely not alone. And that's what Terry found out. He didn't need his friends to solve anything. He just needed them to listen and tell him that his feelings were valid. And just that simple act of sharing his experience made a big difference in how he felt. He realized that other people go through the same things, and that connection helped to ease some of the pressure he was under.
I bet a lot of people can relate to that, even if they're not parents. Sometimes what we really need isn't advice or solutions. It's just someone to hear us out and remind us that we're not alone.
Exactly. It's that shared human experience, that feeling of belonging. That can make a big difference for our well-being, especially during tough times like midlife.
So we've talked about these two strategies for handling the happiness curve: thought control and social connection. Now, I'm curious, how do those actually connect back to those social factors we talked about earlier? You know, the ones that seem to be so important for how happy we are?
That's a great question. It's all connected, really. When we practice thought control, we're basically managing our own inner dialogue, and that can help us have more positive and compassionate relationships with others.
So instead of getting stuck comparing and judging, we're making space in our minds to be more present and supportive in our relationships.
Exactly. And when we focus on social connection, we're strengthening those bonds of trust, support, and belonging, which can help us deal with stress and make us feel more secure and content, even when things are tough.
It's like a positive feedback loop. Taking care of ourselves on the inside helps us show up better in our relationships. And that in turn makes us feel more connected and like we belong, which makes us happier.
Exactly. It's realizing that our happiness isn't just about us as individuals. It's also about our social lives and the quality of our relationships.
This has been so interesting, and I bet our listeners really getting a lot out of this. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to touch on one more thing that really stood out to me in the book.
Sure, what is it?
Well, the book really emphasizes that just knowing about the happiness curve can be empowering. It's like having a roadmap that helps us see the challenges ahead and be ready for them.
Absolutely. It's like knowing that a certain part of the road is going to be bumpy. So you slow down a bit, check your tires,
Yeah.
you know. Instead of being surprised by those bumps, you can be more prepared and in control.
I love that analogy. So instead of thinking about midlife as this inevitable time of crisis and decline, we can see it as a chance for growth and change, knowing that there's potential for even more happiness down the road.
Exactly. It's about changing our perspective and realizing that midlife isn't the end, it's a turning point.
I love that. This has been a really fascinating look at happiness. We explored this idea of a happiness curve where happiness often dips in midlife before going back up later. We talked about the things that contribute to that dip and some ways to navigate it with more awareness and intention.
And we saw how happiness is affected not just by things happening around us, but also by our own thoughts, expectations, and social connections.
Right. And I think one of the most important takeaways is that while the happiness curve is a common pattern, it doesn't have to be our destiny. We're not just along for the ride.
Exactly. We have the power to make choices. We can learn from the research, use helpful strategies, and do things that support our well-being at any age.
Knowing about the happiness curve gives us a bit of an advantage. We can see those potential bumps coming and be ready for them.
Yeah, it's like having a map that shows us what's ahead. We might still come across some hills and valleys, but we'll have a better idea of what to expect and some tools to help us along the way.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a question. Where do you feel like you are on this happiness curve? And what steps can you take starting today to create more happiness and well-being no matter how old you are?
That's something worth thinking about. And remember, even small changes in how we think and what we do can make a big difference over time.
Keep those connections with others strong. Practice being aware of your thoughts, and don't be afraid to reach out for support when you need it.
And remember, the journey of life is full of twists and turns. But there's always potential for more happiness and fulfillment no matter where you are on that curve.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the happiness curve. We hope it's given you some insights and maybe even inspired you a little. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the things that matter to you.